You're listening to the Mythcreant podcast with your hosts, Oren, Chris Winkle, and Bunny.
There was a castle by a waterfall with a pink and purple wall and a princess living there. She had no parents and was all alone. She got by on her own and she liked it pretty well. 'Cause she never wore socks. She had a pet snake. She bought a red guitar and she ate a whole cake. And there wasn't anybody there to tell her what to do, so she did what she wanted to. Everybody knew the story of the princess who saved herself.
This is the Mythcreant podcast. I'm Chris, and with me is...
Oren.
And?
Bunny.
Now, we've been going for over a decade, so we're older than most other podcasts. What do you think that says about us?
It's a classic question.
I think we're very wise, even though you're the ones who have been around that long.
Well, obviously our podcast must be really deep and profound because it's so old. I mean, how can something that's lasted a decade be bad? It stood the test of time.
It's been around for a while. As we know, all podcasts are timeless.
And it can be reinterpreted for each generation, of which there has been one, but theoretically future generations.
What did the hosts mean when they said don't use oppressed mages? Is it possible they meant use oppressed mages?
We'll never know.
This time we're doing modern versus classic stories because we like making people mad, I guess.
We record several of these at once, and the last one always has to be the spiciest because it's getting late and we need to stay awake.
Last episode we were talking about hunger being an emotion, and I haven't eaten yet, so it's getting pretty emotional over here.
Get ready for hanger.
Yeah.
Speaking of hunger, we must again begin with sandwich discourse, because what is a classic?
What I say it is. That's what I've decided.
Yeah.
Chris says.
It does really seem like a classic story is one that is old and one that we laud for whatever reason.
Yeah, that really seems like the only consistent definition.
I want to say a classic is a backlist book that sells well.
That's the cynical answer.
We're getting to the point where The Expanse isn't a classic yet, but it could be one eventually, and we're really getting to the point where, like, a Game of Thrones, the book, is a classic, almost. I would say it's probably not quite there yet. I don't think it's going to be too much longer. Lord of the Rings is obviously a classic, people call it that. The Earthsea books are classics. Sword of Shannara is probably not, even though it's old enough, it's not lauded enough to be considered a classic.
Maybe.
Definitely there is a fame and cultural influence factor. The people still think about it, even though it's older, which is why it still sells. But also the cultural influence a book has, I do think, it maybe isn't necessary, but is a big factor because that makes people want to go back to the original to see that kind of line of influence.
We're talking about in terms of speculative fiction, whereas when you talk about classic books, most of the ones that show up are not going to be spec fic. They're going to be significantly older than what we're talking about in a lot of cases. They're going to be the stuff that you probably had to read in high school, or maybe not anymore. Apparently that's less common now. But if you're our age, The Grapes of Wrath and The Great Gatsby and Catcher in the Rye for some reason. Stuff like that.
Supposedly being good is a prerequisite to being a classic, but I'm not sold.
I said lauded, not good.
When we're talking about classic stories, we don't have to be just talking about novels here. So Cinderella, for instance, it's a fairy tale that's maybe 2,000 years old. That has a hugely long classic Disney. It is classic before Disney.
It was classic before Disney. I guess what I'm getting at is there are classics and then there are classics of things, which suggests that a classic is also meant to be, like, representative of a genre. So if I say, like, Vampire's Kiss is classic Nick Cage, I don't mean that Vampire's Kiss is like The Great Gatsby, but I am saying that it's classic Nick Cage as in representative of Nick Cage.
I'll say that Vampire's Kiss is like The Great Gatsby. I'll be brave enough to make that stand.
I might even say it's better. I think we should laud it more.
Whereas when I say modern, we could also use very different definitions of modern. I would say the type of book currently being published today.
And then there are many things called modern classics, which I have read a couple of that don't seem to have anything to do with each other.
Is that just an advertising blurb phrase?
Yeah,
That's what I thought.
it's the sort of thing you'll read on the quotes.
They say, generic they, somebody says that this is a modern classic. Does it happen to be the publisher of that book who says it's a modern classic?
They might also say something specific. I think Swamplandia, a book I read recently, was like a modern Floridian classic or something like that.
Oh wow, we're getting really niche with our classics.
Maybe it was the Great Floridian Novel, I forget, but it was something like that.
The Great Floridian Novel. Florida Man. Classic novel.
Classic Florida Man.
I think there's some interesting discussion to be had looking at kind of the older stories that we still read today and we still discuss today versus the books that we're publishing now. Mostly because in storytelling there's this, in literary circles, there's this big myth that stories are unchanging. That sometimes we have to tackle when we're talking about stuff. I recently had an article on Freytag's Pyramid, which, if you don't recognize what that term is, if you've seen the little triangle graph where it has like rising action and climax and falling action, that's Freytag's Pyramid. And it's about 200 years old. And in my article, I was like, okay, so this actually did not originally mean something that we're thinking it means today. It means something entirely different, and it's outdated. And I had a commenter who just couldn't wrap their mind around the idea of a story structure being out of date. Because this notion of like, oh, but stories are eternal. And what do you mean?
Definitely like monomyth-esque.
Yeah, the hero's journey is definitely one of those things. Like, oh, don't you know that all of our mythologies have the same points in them and all stories are the same?
It was great when Gilgamesh saved the cat.
Right? Which, again, goes back to the whole discussion about pseudostructures and how, like, the hero's journey sometimes definitely does this weird thing where on one hand, they're like, all stories are automatically have the hero's journey, but also you are supposed to make your story like the hero's journey so it will be good. It can either be prescriptive or it can be descriptive. It can't be both. And I do think that a lot of times in academic fields, when they're studying like folklore or stories in general, they take a very descriptive approach, which kind of assumes that all stories are of equal quality and our job is to just look and see what they're doing. Whereas a storyteller is trying to master a craft, you kind of have to take a prescriptive approach. You can't really become better unless you acknowledge that some things are better than other things.
That's sort of a requirement, but like also, I don't want any of the things that are better to be the things I didn't want to do. Let me know when you get that one solved, okay?
I definitely don't want to hear that my multiple points of view might be detrimental in some way.
You leave my multiple points of view alone.
Take away my extra viewpoints over my dead body.
Hands off my characters with way too much backstory. That's a real problem I have. I write characters with way too much backstory. You stop telling me I can't do that, Chris.
Rude.
Part of the culture is this huge myth that our stories have not advanced, when they absolutely have. My favorite anecdote about stories advancing is from ancient Egyptian literature, when they didn't have first person the way that we do today. As far as I could tell, they didn't have any professional storytellers. What they had is lots and lots of scholars who could write. And so these people would all write fiction as a hobby. But they didn't seem to even have a court gesture or storyteller. They didn't seem to have plays. They didn't have any professional storytellers. But they had tons of hobbyists in their scholar class.
So it's like if all novels were written by college professors? Ugh, I'm not, no, thank you. I've changed my minds on who built the Great Pyramids.
But back then, they didn't have first person directly, so all the stories that use first person, they specifically have a framing device where they start in third person and a character shows up and then is like, hey, let me tell you what happened to me. And then the rest is them talking, which is where we get that kind of like first person retelling narrative premise where it's a future version of the character telling their past. That idea had to be introduced, and then now when we talk about first person, we have not just a first person retelling, but we may have more kind of immersive forms, and we just get right into it and start with I. But that's not a thing that we had a couple thousand years ago.
My hottest take, as it were, is that stories have generally gotten better over time. I said it. I said what I meant, and I meant what I said.
That's interesting.
Oh, Oren, how could you?
And, like, people who don't think that, people who look at modern stories and are like, book talk, romantasy, lit RPG. It's like, sure, I say lit RPG all the time. But I am aware that the past also had many really bad stories. Just atrociously bad. I have read some of them. So if you think that stories were better in the past, it is a symptom of you not being well read enough.
Yeah, I would agree with this. That's hotter than the desert outside Egypt.
And our classics are also, of course, cherry-picked. Not that all of our classics are good, but I'm pretty sure the average classic from a period is going to be better than just the average story from that period.
And even then, if we look best stories that are coming out now compared to the ones that have been preserved because they were good enough that people cared about them and wanted to keep talking about them, I'd put Piranesi against any of the classics I had to read in high school. From any perspective, it's just a better book. And I think you would have a much better time reading it than you would The Grapes of Wrath.
I think people do forget that the quote-unquote classics are just the ones that have been preserved. There were tons of crappy stories in Edwardian England or whatever, but of course they haven't been preserved. For every great expectations, there is an Irene Iddlesley.
Or, like, they have been, but no one reads them. Everyone's read Sherlock Holmes, which has its ups and downs, but it's, like, miles better than a lot of Doyle's other work. Like his, I can't even remember the name now, Professor something, Professor Champion or whatever.
Challenger, I think, which is a try-hard name if I've ever heard one.
Yeah, that's what it is. Oh god, Challenger stories are abysmal. And it's like there's a reason that Doyle is known for his Sherlock stories and not his Challenger stories. Even though the Challenger stories still exist, you can read them. It's just that no one wants to.
Nobody's making you. I'm trying to read Middlemarch right now. Well, basically I'm reading Middlemarch as I wait for other books to arrive at the library, and now that they have, I can put it aside. And because Middlemarch is one of those things that's often called a classic, I looked online to be like, okay, what do people say about Middlemarch? And there are so many really haughty takes, and I feel like we can't talk about classics without talking about some of the elitism that also keeps them aloft. There was an especially bad New Statesman article, and a quote from it published 150 years ago. Oh, this is the tagline of it. George Eliot's epic humanist novel is the antidote to our witless online world. It's boring. Middlemarch is pretty boring.
Wait, hang on. That statement wasn't from 150 years ago.
Virginia Woolf apparently called it one of the few English novels written for grown-up people, which has a similar vibe. But yeah, the New Statesman article was recent. But yeah, calling something a classic kind of sets up this environment where the story is like uncriticizable. And if you say it's boring, you're not a real grown-up. You're just a child who doesn't understand the genius of Dorothea and whatever her guy friend is.
Oh, no.
I got in so much trouble in college when we were doing Shakespeare for saying that the Gloucester character in King Lear is unnecessary because he's just a duplicate. He has the same arc as King Lear, and it goes exactly the same way. And there's no reason to have this other character here. And then we watched Ran, which is Akira Kurosawa's version of King Lear. It's very good, and notably, it has simply deleted the Gloucester character. Like, everything else is almost like a shot-for-shot remake, but not Gloucester. He's just not there, and you wouldn't even notice if you weren't looking for it. Thanks, Kurosawa. It's rare that I get such a beautiful demonstration of my point like that. I've never seen anyone make a movie to prove me right before.
Wow, how about that? Who'da thunk?
I do think this, again, comes along with the myth that just old equals good, which maybe in a time before we had science or advanced understanding of how things worked, something lasting might have been a halfway decent sign. Be like, okay, well, that's still around, so maybe it works since we don't really know. Now it's very silly, but I've seen lots of, like, very serious people try to argue that things are better or profound because they're old. In fact, Bunny, do you remember that, like, ridiculous romantic literary book about comics that you lent me that one time or showed me?
Oh, was it Understanding Comics?
So your comics class that turned out to be about like narrative nonfiction comics.
Yeah, it ended up being about journalistic comics. I don't know, we weren't allowed to do fiction in that. So I snuck in fiction by writing about Mystery Science Theater, but I think it must have been Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud.
So I looked at one of their textbooks in that class, which was like in comic form, and it was very into validating comics and why comics are serious and why you should respect them. And doing that by being like, oh, and we define comics as a series of images, then therefore ancient was one of the arguments that was made in there.
Don't get me wrong, McCloud has some useful stuff about understanding how time moves in comics and how it's different than other mediums, but then he definitely has comics are good if you define them this way. You can see that actually the Bio Tapestry is a comic and so is the Scroll or something like that, which I don't know if you need to justify comics by doing that, whether or not you think that his definition actually holds water. Comics can be recent and also good.
He was one of the people I was making fun of in my satirical, how to be pretentious article because of these ridiculous arguments. The other thing that he did that really annoyed me is his effort to distance himself from superhero stories. It's we gotta make comics look better by saying that comics aren't always about superheroes and superhero stories are ridiculous, but we're deeper than that. Comics can be better than that. And it's we didn't have to throw superhero stories under the bus. That was not a necessary part of this.
Modern comics owe a lot to superhero stories.
As a very armchair anthropology enthusiast, I desperately want the modern obsession with things that being older, being better, to be a result of the fall of the Western Roman Empire, after which there was a period in which big public works and that sort of thing got a lot less common because there was less central authority and what there was a lot weaker. But I know that's not true because the Romans also thought older things were better. So it's it doesn't matter. It just seems to be a universal idea that older stuff is better than newer stuff. That's just, I don't know what to tell you.
It goes hand in hand with kids these days.
Yeah.
I think it is interesting to look at what are the differences between stories today and older stories. What are we seeing? Personally, one thing that I feel I noticed between older and newer stories is the emphasis on immersion in prose works. I definitely feel it's a very modern thing. To be fair, fairy tales are all told in summary, but they also were oral stories, and I suppose maybe if the Brothers Grimm were working today and collecting these oral tales, maybe they would have written them down in more detail and elaborated on them a lot more than they did, for instance. But we wouldn't usually just read a book of stories that are completely told in summary, even though, again, if we're talking about the limits of somebody's memory, for oral tales that does make a certain level of sense. But I just think there's going to be a lot more summary and exposition in older works, and also the prose style, more omniscient narration, whereas we've been moving more towards close perspective and more first person and just emphasizing vivid detail.
I think oral stories too probably had their own kind of immersion that isn't totally captured by writing it down, because even if it is summary, there's a theatricality to it. So oral stories that are just kind of blandly summarized in written work probably didn't feel that way at all when they were being told aloud. And now we figured out how to get that immersion back in a prose medium.
A somewhat direct comparison that I can make, because it's hard to say the differences between modern stories and any classic, because that's a huge time period. But if I'm looking at the differences between modern speculative fiction and stuff that is pre-Lord of the Rings, I would say that now there is a bigger emphasis on trying to make the world make sense. And I think some of that definitely comes from Lord of the Rings, even though I'm not saying Lord of the Rings world makes perfect sense. But Tolkien definitely influenced people to work harder on their setting, to the chagrin of weird essayists everywhere.
Faith by the word.
But then there's also, and this is definitely not Lord of the Rings, there's something else where there is just more respect for the reader's time. Older stories tend to spend a lot more time messing around.
Or don't you think it's because we all have super short attention spans and just we're all going downhill?
It's this witless social media age.
I'm sure that's what it is, but if that's what it takes to stop having stories that have a bunch of prologues and then we fart around for a while in Nowhereville. It's like, please get me to the part that matters.
This is an interesting one because I'm not sure that a shorter attention span is always bad, because it means you value your time more. And I don't know, maybe back in the day, several hundred years ago, a book that was much slower paced would have been considered more engaging, either because there were less books to compare it to, and so there was a novelty in reading a book, or maybe it was because other forms of entertainment were less entertaining, so we had less competition for entertaining media, our standards are lower. Or maybe it was the kind of thing where people like me just wouldn't have read books several hundred years ago because they would have all been too boring to keep my attention. And that just makes books more attractive to more people. It's kind of hard to say exactly what's going there, but it is pretty apparent that stories today are more engaging, that they are just spending the time more efficiently and getting right into the story in comparison to older stories.
It might be worth pointing out that even older stories often did this. At this point, kind of well known that Shakespeare plays, they don't necessarily seem this way to us, but went out of their way to include jokes and stuff that would keep the audience's interest in the middle of the 15th mistaken identity scene.
Oh boy, it's another banquet.
And like the same thing with the sudden bursts of violence and like the murders and stuff. And that doesn't translate super well to a modern audience, but as far as like Elizabethan theater goers, that stuff was definitely written to hold people's attention and help stop them from getting bored. So that's been going on for a while. Maybe the Elizabethan Englishmen didn't have any attention span. Maybe they just like couldn't handle it.
And another thing we've talked about before, that one of the things that is the reason why I said Freytag's Pyramid is outdated, is the emphasis on tragedy that happened during that period of plays. Not just older stories, there was a specific period of time in which tragic plays were just normal. And that was during Freytag's Pyramid time. So the following action in that structure assumes that the hero is going to experience a downfall and then die.
And also that you two will bash, what was it, the Poles? Does he really hate the Poles?
Yeah, he was very racist against the Polish. Gosh, the Polish, we went through some European history videos recently, and man, the Polish had a real tough time for several hundred years there.
Yeah, it was not great. One thing that I always wonder, and I'm just not well read enough to say this with certainty, but just based on what I have read of older European specifically and Near Eastern story tradition, I do kind of wonder if the emphasis on tragedy just comes from the fact that any stories that had happy endings were not good. If you look at stories that have happy endings, especially the older ones, like there's a reason that the term Deus Ex Machina caught on. Like that was a real thing. It's like, well, we don't know how to end this story, so the gods will show up and set everything right. I mean, that happens at the end of the Odyssey. The Odyssey has such a weird ending where it looks like Odysseus is going to have to kill everyone on his island because he showed up and did a bunch of murders on these guys who were trying to seduce his wife, and now everyone's mad at him.
And all the serving maids.
Kills a lot of people. It's pretty brutal. And then Athena is just like, nope, everyone stop, back to your corners. And then they all lived happily ever after, the end. It's just the weirdest way to end that story, especially after reading the Iliad. And even in Shakespeare, other than comedies, like the Shakespeare story that could be considered to not be a comedy and also have a happy ending is The Tempest, which basically just has the Deus Ex Machina again, although only this time it's also Shakespeare's self-insert OC uwu, do not steal.
So nobody had invented the turning point yet, basically. It's like too hard to figure out how heroes can solve problems, so what if the hero just dies instead?
Did we not have enough stories that had a satisfying, triumphant ending, and so everyone just assumed they must be bad? I don't know. It's just, I can't say that with certainty, but it just feels like that when I look at older stories.
It does make you wonder, because the ones that had a happy ending were generally called comedies, which speaks to the idea that we didn't feel that you could have a story that was serious and like deeply emotional and also have a happy ending. Those two things were considered in conflict.
The tragedies, Shakespeare's tragedies, were often also comedic, like they had comedic elements. Notably, the beginning of Romeo and Juliet has a lot of antics with Mercutio mostly. Like there's that scene where he's I think right before he dies, where he's teasing Romeo about Queen Mab and stuff like that. A scene which I think some of the playfulness of that scene has held up, and that's an interesting thing worth analyzing, whereas some of the dick jokes don't so much.
I do think it almost takes more confidence and perhaps more skill as a storyteller, feel that I don't need to make dick jokes and I can still hold the audience's attention.
Yeah, let's say that. All my stories don't contain dick jokes because I am very confident.
So I guess this leaves us with a final question, since we're running out of time here, is should you read classics? My answer is if you want to, yes. Like, if you like classics, read what you like. Otherwise, I don't think you should make yourself do it. I think that there are modern stories that are just as good, if not better, than any classic you might be recommended.
If you are fascinated by stories, which you might be since you are listening to this podcast, then reading classics gives you the opportunity to see the origin of many story tropes, which I find rewarding when I can manage to pay attention to them because they are so boring.
They're also just interesting historical snapshots, not because they are necessarily representative of the time, but because they are representative of what sorts of stories were being told about the time.
There can be a rewarding experience to see, and of course sometimes people just like being, tuned into the cultural conversation, since they are stories that are often referenced and discussed, and it's nice to feel like you're in the know when somebody references a classic. So there's plenty of reasons to read them, but I don't think anybody should feel that they're not cultured if they don't read them, or that they're obligated to read them. I think it's fine to find modern stories that you enjoy.
With that, I think we can go ahead and call this episode to a close.
With that hot take.
Well, if we didn't make you mad, or if we did make you mad, you can still support us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/mythcreants.
And before we go, I want to thank a couple of our existing patrons. First, there's Amon Jabber. He's an urban fantasy writer and a connoisseur of Marvel. Then there's Kathy Ferguson, who's a professor of political theory in Star Trek. We will talk to you next week.
There was a dragon with a pointy tail. He was bigger than a whale and his breath was terrible. He scared the princess when he came around. Tried to burn the castle down, but she caught him by his tail. Then she tied him to a tree so the dragon couldn't fly. She told him he was mean and it made the dragon cry. When he finally apologized, she offered him some tea. He accepted it graciously. Now he visits every weekend with the princess who saved herself.
This has been the Mythcreant podcast. Opening closing theme, The Princess Who Saved Herself by Jonathan Colton.